Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on Shabbat podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Kipp Davis. And today we're going to be discussing Wes Huff continuing to get the Isaiah scroll all wrong.
This is all I do now. Is I just go on YouTube and I talk about 1Q Isaiah A and Wes Huff. That's it. That's all I do. So
before we get into the clips, can you provide a brief recap on the situation? Where did this all start with the whole Isaiah scroll business? For those that are not familiar.
Yeah, sure. So like Wes Huff ended up across the table in a discussion with Billy Carson, and as a result went from a few thousand subscribers on YouTube to like 250,000 in the space of a few weeks. And this got the attention of the largest podcasting media platform in the world, Joe Rogan. And so Wes appeared on the Joe Rogan show, and in the course of his conversation with Joe Rogan, it's been oft repeated now. There have been multiple responses made to it. There have been lots of frantic apologetic responses, defenses of it. But at one point in the podcast, Wes brings up one of them. I actually think Joe Rogan brings up the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wes Huff brings up the most famous of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is 1Q Isaiah A, the so-called Great Isaiah Scroll. It was one of the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls to be discovered. It is a completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah, and that on its own makes it very unusual because there are almost no other intact, complete copies of manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's a special text, right? And in the course of his conversation, he makes the claim that that 1Q Isaiah A is word for word identical to the Masoretic text. Joe Rogan is obviously impressed by this because he repeats it back to word for word, and Wes Huff responds word for word. About 10 minutes later in the conversation, Joe Rogan actually comes back to this and says that he still can't get over it. He thinks it's a miracle, is what he said. And then in the next week, sorry, Claude Simeon, that's probably my my equipment, but I am happy to announce that the new computer is on its way. So yay.
Awesome.
Yes, I should have it next week. But anyways, in a later conversation that Joe had with another guest, they're sitting around and they're smoking cigars, and he says he recalls his meeting and his discussion with Wes Huff, and he says, I can't get this out of my mind. He says, I can't stop thinking about it. It's keeping me up at night. That 1Q Isaiah A, the Great Isaiah Scroll, was 1,000 years earlier than the next earliest copies of the Masoretic text. This would be the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. And he says it again. He says it was verbatim, identical. So now many people right away recognized that this was a false claim, and it probably wouldn't have garnered the attention that it ended up getting if not for Joe Rogan, and if not for the fact that Rogan himself was so impressed by this. I really think that is what that's what sort of produced this onslaught, this cavalcade. I think Rogan made a short or a couple of videos out of just that clip because he and his producers were so impressed by it. So that's where this started. Dan McClellan, my friend and colleague, fellow Diablo critic, made a response video to this. Alex O'Connor, formerly the Cosmic Skeptic, made a response video to this. Christian apologists, Ruslan KD talked about this for like every day for like 2 weeks. Gavin Ortland whom I've had online discussions with on other topics, made a response video in an effort to rescue, salvage the credibility of the claim that Wes Huff had made. Another channel, that the big channel, I was surprised I didn't realize it was this big, called Daily Dose of Wisdom, relatively recently made a video also attempting to rescue this this rather critical error made on part of 1Q Isaiah, because as it turns out, and as people who work with these manuscripts, people who work in the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, people generally who work in the text of Isaiah will recognize that 1Q Isaiah A actually has a high number of textual variants. Now, I mean, the conversation has shifted, I think, to the significance of this. Well, are these meaning variants? How many of these are meaning variants? How many of them are minor matters of spelling, or the replacement of synonymous language, or changes in syntax or verb forms, or these sorts of things, right? But in order to gain a clearer sense of why we're in the situation we're in, also, I think it's probably helpful to underscore just the history of the publication of the manuscript itself, 1Q Isaiah A, which was published in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert, volume 32. It was edited by Peter W. Flint and Eugene Ulrich. I worked for Peter Flint on this project for it was 2 or 3 years, I think. I was actually the first one tasked with compiling the variants list that ended up being over 90 pages of textual variants in the edition of 1Q Isaiah A. And in the introduction to the variants, Ulrich and Flint state that as a result of the high number of differences, and they're tracking differences not just with the Masoretic text, but with other textual witnesses to the book of Isaiah. They're tracking with the Septuagint, with the Syriac, with the Targumim, with other manuscripts, other so-called Masoretic manuscripts in the Masoretic tradition of Isaiah, and I believe also quotations from the New Testament, and maybe even some rabbinic literature as well. It was a long developmental process. Like when I started on the project, I think I was only working on checking 1Q Isaiah A against the Masoretic text. All the other witnesses to Isaiah at Qumran, which is something I think we should talk about at some point this evening. The Septuagint, all the witnesses to the Masoretic text at Qumran, the Masoretic text, the other witnesses to Isaiah at Qumran, the Masoretic text itself. And I think I was also doing the Syriac. Yeah, I was working on the Syriac too. But, and more hands got involved as time went on and that list expanded. But it got so extensive that Ulrich and Flint made the decision, and this isn't unusual, in any edition of biblical texts in the DJD series, readers will discover that scholars tend to just provide the data and don't draw much of any conclusions or attempt to sort through the reasons for variation in a text. This is just as a critical edition, this is a repository of information from which scholars will work from in the future. And that's the work that needs to be done now. In the edition, Ulrich and Flint state at the outset that the work of cataloging and compartmentalizing and assessing and analyzing the individual variants in 1Q Isaiah A was a further step beyond just the work of getting the data onto the page, which is what they were doing. And some of that work has been done. There was an excellent article published in 2014 by Drew Longaker, who did his PhD at the University of Birmingham, worked for a time at the University of Groningen, and is now, I believe, on another postdoc at Duke. But he wrote a very nice article in 2014 about the second half of 1Q Isaiah A and some of the text critical issues there, and has expanded and provided additional useful information to our overall knowledge base about this manuscript.
All right, so let's take a look at the clip from the Joe Rogan interview. So I'm gonna play a part of it. I'm gonna skip the 46 minutes. That's the part I want to clip. We'll start here.
On the average size of manuscripts in and around that time, and also the average spacing of words and the margins on top, bottom, and the side, recreate what the manuscript could have possibly looked like.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Can you pause it for a second, Jacob?
Yeah.
I want to provide some clarification here. And this is just what can happen in the shorthand of attempting to provide understandable sound bites to a large audience. But when he says that the oldest witness to the text of Isaiah, or the earliest witness to the text of Isaiah prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was the Masoretic text, known from the Leningrad Codex. That is I would have said that differently, because prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we still also had Greek translations of the book of Isaiah in manuscripts that predate the medieval codices, the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex. We have copies of these from the 4th century, and I mean these are witnesses to the text of Isaiah. Mind you, they're witnesses in form of a translation, but they were useful to scholars prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls for attempting to reconstruct what the text looked like, and how it developed and why it developed over time. Hey, quiet, buddy.
And the thing that really shocked
Sorry.
scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that
So this
it
is
right
the Great
there?
Isaiah Scroll. So if you go to Israel and you go...
Is that papyrus?
Yes. No, I think that one is vellum.
What is vellum?
So I should be more specific. So parchment is animal skin. Vellum can be used synonymously with the term parchment. Technically, parchment is like baby animal skin, like calves or lambs. But this is the Great Isaiah Scroll, and you can see like they stitch together the parchment because it's so long.
God, it's so beautiful. The way they wrote back then was so beautiful. I mean, maybe it's because I can't read it, that it's so fat. Maybe if I saw
Probably.
English, I would think that's beautiful too.
Yeah.
Especially script, like if cursive. Cursive is very beautiful. But that is so fascinating because obviously coming from a point of ignorance, the letters look so similar. Like so many of this is the what I always got about cuneiform. When I look at that, I'm like, it's just one particular sort of character that's this way and that way and up and down and
cuneiform is wild.
Weird.
It's really, really tricky. And that's the thing when, like, if you're studying ancient languages and you start to study Greek, like the Greek alphabet is similar enough that you're like, okay, alpha looks like an A, right? Delta looks like a D. So you can figure it out. And so it tricks you because you start off and you're like, oh, this is phobios, fear. I know what a phobia is. And you get this false sense of encouragement. And then, the further you go down the rabbit hole, you're like, oh, I'm screwed. So, but Hebrew is completely the opposite because the writing system is so different. The learning curve is hard at the beginning. And then you're like, everything is just 3 letters with a suffix added to it. And so it feels like, whereas the opposite is true with Greek. Greek, you're like, I get this. And then when you really go down the rabbit hole, you're like, oh crap, none of the things that I learned about that are supposed to be standard, all of them have exceptions.
So I'll pause there. Did you want to say anything to that before I get to the next clip?
No, I mean, I think, it's the word for word claim, as many people have been pointing out, was an overreach. It was something that obviously a lot of people misunderstood if he meant to say something different to how it came out. But he's not wrong about a number of things here. That was my experience with the languages too, was that the learning curve for Hebrew is tougher in the beginning, and it does get easier as you go on, but especially compared to Greek. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's a lot more to say about that.
So there's something he says at 111. I think it's over here. Let me play this part.
So we almost have a perspective where we want something to be very exhaustive, that ancient writers didn't have those same sort of conventions. Or so they're going to capitalize on certain ideas and concepts for the purpose of, when someone tells you a story, you don't memorize everything.
Right.
You go to university, you write notes, right? The people who are writing everything the professor is saying word for word, probably not the people who are going to remember what the professor says as well as the people who write down the main things. And when you write down the main things, the main points, without all of...
I wrote... hold on, I'm going to let my dog out here just a second.
Okay.
I wrote pretty extensive notes when I was in university. Just saying, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to go back about 10 minutes earlier, a little over 10 minutes earlier.
Okay.
At the end of the first hour.
Sure.
Because this goes together very well with what goes on here.
What was it based on? What in the beginning there was light? What is all of that?
Yeah.
What are those stories?
Yeah.
And when you take these stories and you are telling them for so long, that's why the book of Isaiah, what you were telling me, is so fascinating. That 1,000 years later, you have the exact translation of this at a time where most people were illiterate. Right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's only really been recently that we have the levels of literacy that we have today. I mean, this is part of the reason why you have these long spans of time between when people live and then the ancient biographies that start to pop up about them, is because most people are just illiterate.
But imagine how crazy that is, that something in a time where there's no printed press and something that had been passed on for so long as an oral tradition is exact word for word written.
It's pretty wild.
You find in a cave in Qumran.
Yeah.
And then the same thing you get in the English translation of the Bible today. That's nuts.
Yeah. I mean, up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
I think that's the part you were talking about where Joe went on to say how he's continually amazed by what Wes claimed. about the word for word agreement that he thinks is
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. So I think it's worth saying, maybe it's worth saying something here too, just about the manuscript tradition that we have beyond, like into the medieval period for the Hebrew Bible texts. There is remarkable preservation in the medieval manuscripts, and excuse me, one of the reasons for that is because sometime in the 5th or 6th century CE, the Masoretes developed systems for checking and ensuring the really precise accuracy of their copies of manuscripts. Now, importantly, I think it's important to point this out. These are conventions of scribalism that can't be retroactively retrodacted backwards. This is not the same scribal situation that we see exhibited in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm talking just beyond a text like 1Q Isaiah. I'm talking about, across the broader spectrum of all the manuscripts that we have. The conventions, the scribal conventions, were not consistent, and in many respects they were much more fluid. And this has led to a number of issues in terms of just even evaluating how we identify and isolate biblical texts from non-biblical texts in, the late Second Temple period. Because what we have is like texts that belong basically on a spectrum. On the one end, from perfect copy or near perfect copy, all the way sliding down to the other end, where we have liberal, extensive paraphrases and rewritings of stories, laws, poetry, prophecies. Like this is all in there. So a text like the Temple Scroll is not classified as a biblical manuscript because it's so dramatically different from, the book of Isaiah, which seems to be its closest, or sorry, the book of Deuteronomy, which seems to be its closest source text. But in the minds of the people who actually wrote this text, what did they think they were doing? You could say the same thing for groups of manuscripts that actually look quite a bit closer to their exemplar. There's a collection of texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Reworked Pentateuch, or I think more commonly referred to now just as 4Q Pentateuch. It was originally called the Reworked Pentateuch because of the dramatic differences between these manuscripts and any other versions of the text in the Pentateuch that we already knew of. But now it's the movement among scholars is towards labeling it just as 4Q Pentateuch, because this fascinating group of manuscripts appears possibly to be, our earliest evidence for the first attempts of putting the 5 books of Moses together for the first time. And moreover, while they preserve a pretty dramatically different text of the Torah or the Pentateuch from the other versions that we have, why would we not consider this just another version of Torah manuscripts? So it's I say all that just to sort of illustrate the complexity of this overall situation and to raise some of the questions that Christian apologists just never really get into when it comes to dealing with the textual history of the Bible with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I mean, we'll see a lot of that moving forward here.
So I'm going to look at one more clip from here, about 2 hours and 45 minutes. This part's not necessarily about Isaiah, but I think he tries to make some kind of link between Jesus and the book of Jonah, I think. Here we go.
The community of the disciples of Jesus wrote. And so we actually have a very close connection to the time. And we see early on that you have guys like Ignatius of Antioch arguing that there are only 4 Gospels. He's in the 2nd century, and there couldn't be any more than 4. Or Theophilus of Antioch makes the similar argument, and they name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Ignatius of Antioch also talks about other Gospels, but he specifically highlights the fact that the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of, these ones that we kind of hear about, Mary, Judas, that the reason we know that they're not associated with the names that are attached to them is because they're being written in times when those people were dead, and they have these rings of pagan philosophy that are incorporated into them, which is completely foreign to 1st century Judaism. So Jesus would not have, so in the Gospel of James, Jesus is worshiping a goddess named Sophia. It's like, okay, well, no 1st century Jew is going to do that. That's obviously paganism. And so we have these early conversations. But when Christians are thinking about, well, what is and isn't Scripture, the earliest Christians are Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And the Jews had this idea that the promises of God are followed up by the writings, the documents that establish those. So the word that's often used is covenant, right? God makes a covenant with people, and that's always followed up by written text. So this is why sometimes, well, in the case of Moses, it's literally inscribed on a tablet, right? And in the prophets, sometimes you get this command, write this on a scroll and inscribe this on a tablet.
So I'll stop it there.
Do you have a
response?
question? Okay. Well, first of all, I listen. My hackles go up, and I get really suspicious anytime anyone talks about what all Second Temple Jews or no Second Temple Jews would have thought. I mean, if there is one thing that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has contributed to, it's the expansion of our knowledge on just how dynamic Judaism of the 1st centuries BCE and CE actually was. To the point now where I think scholars have kind of caught on and recognized that we have to be much more careful in talking about what we think, 1st century Jews would have thought or would have done and not thought and not done. To say that, no Jews would be worshiping Sophia alongside Yahweh. I mean, they were doing this in Elephantine, 400 years earlier. There is there's some pictographic evidence surviving from Jewish synagogues of syncretizing Judaism with Hellenistic religious ideas. This is a period in which I think it's easy if you just look at a lot of the source literature, which tends to be pretty apologetic. This in the form, and our earliest sources, this in the form of the New Testament or the writings of Josephus or Philo. You get the false impression that Judaism was like this great monolith of united ideals, thought, and cultural expression. But those just aren't borne out by a broader, more comprehensive survey of Jewish literature in conjunction with the material culture, what we're discovering in archaeological excavations and through numismatics and coins and pottery and even some texts.
All right.
Did you have a question, or did you have anything to say about that? Just that's what really piqued piqued my interest in that little clip. Yeah.
Well, one question I think I can think of right now is when he brings up that the earliest Christians were Jews that believed Jesus was the Messiah, and he tries to like impose that in some sense on first century Judaism in a somewhat vague way, but he at least tries to imply it. And as you were just saying, he's generalizing Second Temple Judaism.
Yeah.
So what do you make of his attempt to do that specifically? What's he trying to do there?
So I think he's trying to I mean, this is one of the things that I think Christian apologetics feels a lot of pressure to promote is that messianic expectation in the form that it took in early Christianity was totally normative, and it's something that we can track backwards through the texts of the Hebrew Bible. You can trace this into early Judaism. I think that's what's prompting this, because I sense that it's coming from this strong belief, right? Like evangelicals in particular want to promote this strong belief that the expectation for Jesus is something that was already in place hundreds of years prior to the birth of Jesus. This is how you can look at texts from the Hebrew prophets and understand or interpret them as messianic prophecies that were fulfilled in Jesus. It kind of it's sort of working in tandem with that idea, whereas someone like me and most scholars would just look at how early Jews are handling their scriptures more generally and the ways in which they're reading them and negotiating these texts. And Christianity fits into that larger milieu, right? But it seems obvious that they're constructing their own identity and their own narratives out of these pre-existing texts. So it's not so much that these are prophecies under fulfillment as much as it is that Christians are writing their story to map on to these ancient Hebrew texts. So I think that's probably feeding into what he's doing here.
All right, so we're going to take a look at this second clip from the Alex O'Connor video.
Okay.
Wes Huff was just on Joe Rogan to talk 1,000 years older than the oldest one that we had until then. Take a listen.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, Like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600. Yeah. Now, most of these variants are small. They're differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there, which tells us that they were a later addition. Here are some words from the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls project by the Israel Museum, which houses the Isaiah scroll. The text of the Great Isaiah scroll generally confirms the Masoretic or traditional version codified in medieval codices, all 66 chapters of the Hebrew version in the same conventional order. At the same time, however, the 2,000-year-old scroll contains alternative spellings, scribal errors, corrections, and most fundamentally, many variant readings. Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses. Well over 2,600. Again, many of these variants are minor, but Wes Huff told Joe Rogan that the scroll is word for word identical with the Masoretic text.
It was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
So I'll stop it there for a moment. I want to ask you about the video responses that were done against Alex O'Connor because of what he said here,
Right?
Among other things he said in this video. Was Alex overall correct about what he said, or did he make any actual mistakes?
Alex was technically correct, which is the best kind of correct, right? Like, seriously, on the merits of everything that he said, he is absolutely not wrong at all. One thing that was never brought up by Wes in his conversation with Rogan was the quality of the types of differences that you see, the textual variation itself. Most of it does not affect meaning in the text itself. However, that's not always the case. I think there are a handful of places that we can point to, and he pointed to one where potentially the omission of verses 9 to 10 in chapter 2 of 1Q Isaiah A can have an effect on how people are reading that text. There are a variety of opinions among scholars as to the reason why that text was either omitted or added. I still tend to think it was probably added at some point in the textual history of Isaiah. But importantly, there are scholars who also make arguments for its omission. But in either case, one thing that is clear about this particular variation in the text, and it's this, that somebody made a deliberate editorial change in one direction or the other, either removing text or adding text. This wasn't a mistake. And here, what I'm saying, a mistake is where a scribe misses by accident some text that he is copying, or includes text, additional text by accident that he didn't mean to, or he's miswriting words or letters, or he's misspelling, right? Those are errors, and that's not what this is. Whether the text was originally longer or shorter, someone at some point made the decision either to omit these words in verses 9 to 10, or to include them and add them and expand the text. And this is, generally speaking, what I would say is reflective of the scribal situation within first century, within Roman Judaism of Roman Palestine within the period of the first centuries BC and CE. Scribes are not shy about making changes and alterations to the text that they have before them. And they're also not so careful to mark the changes that they make. They just make them for the most part. So, yeah, so in principle, I think, and this is, I think this is what I saw at the outset when content creators started responding to Wes Huff's claim. This is what they were doing. They were pointing out that in fact 1Q Isaiah A by every metric is not word for word identical to the Masoretic text. It's a simple claim and it's a simple correction. This should have been the end of it.
So now I'm going to play a clip from Wes Huff because some people, and I saw someone, at least one person in the chat says, oh, he corrected himself. No big deal. But did he really correct himself? Let's take a look.
Just
145. Okay, so it's going to be at 145.
Or these obvious and clear missteps. There is, however, a criticism I'm seeing online that I think does require some attention and correction on my part. At around the 40-minute mark, Joe asked me a question about the Great Isaiah Scroll. And when he asks me how close it is to the modern Hebrew copies of Isaiah, I say that it is word for word identical to the later Masoretic text. This was admittedly a hyperbolic statement that I should have been much more careful on. My area of expertise when it comes to manuscripts is almost exclusively New Testament, although I do have some work with a handful of 1st century Greek fragments on the Dead Sea Scrolls for comparative work, and I note in my doctoral dissertation instances of parashot, division markers in the Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, up front, I am not, nor do I claim to be, a Dead Sea Scrolls expert, but let me tell you why I said what I said. What was going on in the back of my mind was a quote that I was recalling from Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer's A Survey of the Old Testament, where he talks about the copies of Isaiah found in Qumran Cave 1 in 1947, that they were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscripts previously known, proving to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible, and more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text, specifically the Leningrad Codex, calling it...
So, and I know Alex O'Connor has been like a dog on a bone with this stuff, and I do appreciate it, because I just appreciate when lots of people are paying attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's awesome. That's amazing. But I also think it's worthwhile for us to ensure that we're being really clear communicators here. In these public forums, because there's a lot of people watching and listening. Let's look at this quote from Gleason Archer. Even though the two copies of Isaiah, that's 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B, discovered in Qumran Cave 1 near the Dead Sea in 1947, were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscript previously known in 980, they proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text, meaning that in more than 95% of the text, they were word for word identical, which also means that in 5% of the text, they were not, right? And then he goes on to say, but 1Q Isaiah B from around 75 BC, which is too early. It's certainly later than that. 1Q Isaiah B is easily 1st century CE. The preserved text is almost letter for letter identical with the Leningrad manuscript, which is true. It's a much closer copy to the Masoretic text. The 5% of variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling. And a lot of this has to do with how you're choosing to crunch the numbers there. I'm not entirely convinced that's totally accurate either. But I think that this statement is not saying what Wes is promoting it to say in his paraphrase of it. Like, I think this is a situation where I think I would have just preferred him to read what Archer was saying instead of providing his own paraphrase on it. And, Alex O'Connor in his second video on this has spent quite a bit of time pointing out the ways in which West has sort of massaged this statement to say something that it's not even really saying.
All right, so now we're going to take a look at Sean McDowell's defense of Wes Huff.
Yeah.
Close is the manuscript 1Q Isaiah A from the Dead Sea Scrolls to our current copies of the Bible.
Now we're going to skip to 2150. Let's start at 2145.
The amount of variance is going to be much, much less. So I think we're seeing different.
I'm going to go back a little bit more.
Sure.
Malko or Malki. Malki would be my king. Malko would be his king. Is Malko one word or two words? Right? So if Malko in your statistics is just one word, well, then your common denominator, like your total words in 1Q Isaiah A, is going to be much, much less. And therefore, the amount of variance is going to be much, much less. So I think we're seeing different statistics thrown out there because we're counting the words and the variance differently in 1Q Isaiah A. Also, some people give statistics that aren't exhaustive, and that should be understood. Even in my dissertation, it wasn't an exhaustive analysis of every single difference in 1Q Isaiah A, and we can get back to that in a moment if you'd like.
I'll stop there. Do you have a comment?
I'm just trying to process this, and I'm not great with numbers or math, so somebody can correct me. But because this has come up a couple of times now, that one of the problems with the count of the numbers of variance in 1Q Isaiah A is just in how to define, the broad basis of how many words there are in the actual text. Because for people who are unfamiliar with Hebrew, and by the way, if you're interested in learning Hebrew, I will be starting a new Hebrew course offered through Digital Hammurabi in the first week of March. So sign up, everyone. I don't think the link is active yet, but it will be momentarily. Anyways, if you know Hebrew, you understand that words or words are formed through compounds. So pronouns, objects, and subjects can be attached to individual verbs or nouns, and sometimes nouns can be compounded into what we call construct chains. So when you have something like Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, it's got an inseparable preposition ba on it, which means in, and then the wilderness. Midbar is the wilderness there, right? Is that one word or is that two words? What Anthony is suggesting is that within our software search engines of the biblical text, they all count every particle of Hebrew, even when they're attached to other words, as a single word or a single morpheme. So does that then form your total word count for the entire manuscript. When Dan McClellan did his word count for all of the book of Isaiah, he came up with something like 22,000 or 25,000 words or something to that effect, just by, doing a global search in accordance. Now, what Anthony is suggesting here is that, if we're counting a word as a morpheme with all its component parts, including prefixed and suffixed pronouns or prepositions or other features like interrogative particles, then that number is going to be a lot lower. So, and I think, I've seen counts in the range of about 16,000 words. But here's the thing. I think, and maybe I'm wrong about this and someone can correct me, but if it's actually 16,000 words as opposed to 22,000 words, that doesn't actually change the number of variants, though, because all the variants didn't suddenly, the number of the variants certainly didn't shrink just by factoring into a new definition of what a word is. It just means that maybe some words have multiple variants in them, right? And that can happen. So I don't know that this is very helpful for analyzing, the actual ratio of how many changes there are in the text. And I'll be honest, the bean counting, the counting up the number of variants and, weighing that against the total text of the book of Isaiah and providing a percentage, that's not all that interesting to me. There's much more interesting things going on in this manuscript. That's something we could talk about, hopefully, this evening as we go through this. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think we'll be talking about it in just a second here, because I'm going to go to about 23 minutes in which he talks.
Right.
He starts talking about the meaning differences or lack thereof.
Okay, sure.
Don't result in a synonymous reading. So, like if the reading between MT and 1Q Isaiah A is a synonymous reading, I didn't count it as a variant. So all of the readings that yield a different meaning, whether or not that meaning was very significant or not very significant, the text aligned 96.44%. There were 903 differences that yielded a difference in meaning. So it yielded a 96.44% alignment between MT and 1Q Isaiah A. But
I mean, that number seems pretty high, doesn't it? Like, I mean, it's there's a couple things I think that need to be said, largely about this whole conversation and everything that's taken place over the last couple of months concerning this particular manuscript. People are learning that scribes were very, very good at producing faithful copies of the manuscripts that they were tasked with copying. That they were good at doing the work of preserving and transmitting text, but they were also doing other things too. Scribes were also clearly, not perfect and made mistakes, and scribes were also participants in the transmission process, in the editorial process of these texts. Scribes made decisions about what to do with certain texts, and they would make decisions which affected the meaning of the text that they had for them, either because they thought that the texts in the first place were wrong, or they made them uncomfortable, or any other variety of reasons. So I think it's really important for people to understand and to appreciate all of that. Yeah, so he said, sorry, he said something. So yeah, he said now this is the other thing, and I think this is I'm not sure why. Like if you're a text critic, your job should be this meticulous analysis of the actual text. And if that's what you're doing, then why aren't you including synonyms in that evaluation? Because synonyms are still textually different from one another, even though a synonym will mean the same thing or a very, very similar thing to another word. It still represents an editorial change, a decision made on the part of a scribe to affect the text for whatever reason, right? I think I pretty fundamentally disagree with his selection criteria here of ignoring synonymous language. I think that that's the job of someone else. Text critics should be focused on collecting the data and the information and providing views, perspectives, models of textual history on the basis of this data. If you're ignoring the synonymous language, then that's not helpful to the overall project, I don't think.
Then I had this other set of statistics where if I eliminated all those differences that result from the scribal process, so a scribal error, for example, a letter sounded the same, it looked the same, a scribe's eye skipped from one line to the other line, or he interpreted the text, he was updating the text to fit its contemporary usage, things like that. If I eliminated all of those differences and I was only left with these differences, like, hey, I don't know how these got here. Like there isn't any apparent reason. I yielded 31 differences, which led to a 99.88% alignment between MT and 1Q Isaiah A. So just my statistics, people might disagree with how I did this, but that's my methodology.
So I'll stop there. Do you have any more comments on that?
I'll just say I think it's problematic if you're ignoring synonymous language in your calculation of textual differences.
All right, now I'm going to skip to 44 minutes and we'll be done with this clip.
Okay.
One letter difference. And it does not change the meaning at all.
Let me go back a second.
Letter for letter. Now that's a little hyperbolic because there's one text, the Masada Leviticus B text, that has one difference, one letter difference, and it does not change the meaning at all. So Emmanuel Tove says this text has about 473 words. In my calculation, it was about 600 words. And again, I've already talked about how you can arrive at different words.
Right.
And it's only one difference. And it's a difference of spelling. That's the difference.
That's
do you
crazy.
Do you represent an I with a consonant or not? That's the difference. Every single letter for letter aligns with the MT. The Leviticus Masada A scroll does the same thing. It's very, very closely aligned with the MT. So what's getting lost in this conversation, Sean, is that we're approaching 1Q Isaiah A from different perspectives, but what's getting lost is Wes Huff's original point that there are Dead Sea Scrolls that are aligned word for word with MT. Now,
I'll stop there.
Hold on. I want to hear what he says next.
Less people have heard about Masada Leviticus A and Masada Leviticus B for several reasons.
Pause it
On the
now.
one hand, it's Leviticus.
Yeah.
So, he's pointing out that, and this is, I don't know, I definitely have a different perspective on this. One of the reasons I started I have a long form series about the Dead Sea Scrolls on my channel called The Dead Sea Scrolls Unapologetically. It's I number them funny, so I think it's at least 6 or 7 videos deep. It's already over 4 hours long. One of the reasons why I went to make this series is because there's such a strong focus in apologetic circles on a selective view of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their contribution to biblical studies. I'm trying to provide a more comprehensive view. And in a more comprehensive view of the entire collection of Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts, yes, Ferguson is absolutely correct. We have quite a number of manuscripts which are really impressively close to the later Masoretic text witnesses. But what he's not saying is we also have piles of manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls which align to different versions of the Bible. We have Hebrew copies of texts which look very close to the underlying text of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. We have lots of copies of texts which preserve variants from the Samaritan Pentateuch and appear to align with that tradition. We have plenty of other texts which don't appear to cleanly align with any of these versions and are sort of presently in a catch-all category of their own as not closely enough aligned to either NT or LXX or SP. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned before, we have lots of other manuscripts because we're dealing with a spectrum here, right? In terms of very, very close fidelity with later textual witnesses on the one side, and extremely free paraphrastic renderings on the other side of the spectrum and everything in between. So, but we do have to deal with this other side of the spectrum where we have lots of texts which certainly look for all intents and purposes to be biblical texts, whatever that means to these people in this period, but which we would never recognize as such because they're not in the Bible. That's the only difference. So, I mean, I would say that that's the much larger conversation that we should be having here. We shouldn't be fixating on a handful of our favorite manuscripts just because they happen to look the closest to the Masoretic text. And I'll say one other thing about this too. And the other thing that really irritates me in this whole discussion is how much so many of these guys are prioritizing the Masoretic text. Why are we doing this? Why? They didn't do it in antiquity, so why are we doing this? One of the things that the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate to us is this textual pluriformity and the fact they didn't seem to care. So can we please stop with attempting to promote the Masoretic text as some sort of idealized version of the Bible? Because it is not.
And Derek says, why are y'all hating on God's anointed Wes? He's right always. It's word for damn word, you suckers.
Derek should probably stay after class, Derek, because I doubt you were listening to my soapbox lecture, were you?
All right, so the next one is just a YouTube short. This is not about the Isaiah scroll, but more. This one's about the word Elohim.
around the word in both cases.
So any thoughts on that, Kipp?
I mean, he's not wrong. Okay. Well, he's wrong about one thing. It's not Elohim is not the plural of El. El is actually I would prefer to say that is most certainly in every instance a name for a god, the god El. It's a specific identifier for a specific god. Elohim is the plural of Eloah. And he's correct in that in the Hebrew Bible, the vast majority of these, while it appears plural, are singular references to the God of Israel. Occasionally, references to individual other divine beings. Rarely, they're actually plurals, plural nouns. So, very interesting. Sorry, I just noticed in the chat that I'm apparently out of my depth here. That's curious to me. So, yeah. So he's I mean, he's basically correct here though, in that most of the time in the Hebrew Bible where you see the word Elohim, even though it takes the form of a plural, it's singular. And the reason we know this pretty emphatically is because most of the time it takes singular verbs as opposed to plural verbs, and the pronominal the pronouns that refer back to it are also all singular. So yeah, I don't have a problem with it.
Reasons for why these numbers vary, because everyone needs to hear this. Counting is subjective. Wielding a sword of scholarly consensus in textual matters is disingenuous, Wes. We can't just count up every single difference. It doesn't really work that way. But I'm finding that these numbers don't really mean much. So Wes, they list it as a textual variant.
What a dramatic beginning.
It's pretty great.
All right, let's go to 21. We'll start with 21.
Okay, so I have to say something about this.
Yeah.
And I just watched this video. It just dropped this afternoon, and I was just watching it. And I have to I just have to draw some attention to this because it's all right. So just play from, I think it's about 21:30ish or so, wherever further back. Yeah,
That's about
to
this.
where
That's
he-
yeah. We'll start at 21:16.
Okay, but it's becoming it fast because clearly this is the need. It's really difficult, Wes. I just want to say this, to actually nail down what folks mean by a word in the Hebrew text. Okay,
Right.
And some of people are like, wait, what? Now, the reason for this, is in Hebrew, I can actually say I love you in one word.
Okay, pause it
I can
there for a
say
second.
Ahavti.
Pause it for a second. I want to make sure everybody heard it. Maybe back it up like 5 seconds if you can, Jacob. But I just want to repeat this so everybody caught that. John Mead has said that in Hebrew,
one word,
you can there.
Mhm.
Yeah. In Hebrew, you can,
I can
say a simple
Ahavtika,
sentence
I
in
love
one
you.
word.
I can just
There.
Mhm.
So that's he uses this example. He says in Hebrew, you could say a simple sentence just using one word. You could say I love you in biblical Hebrew by saying ohavtika, and he's right about that. The problem here is that this is not what's on the screen. The word that's on the screen is hatikva, and it means like the hope. But you can hear it, I think, John said Ohavtika. I didn't write it out. I can write this out, what this looks like in the chat here. Let me just do that for everyone. So this is what John actually said. Ohavtika. So, and that is a first common singular perfect verb with a second masculine singular suffix. Ohavti is the verb, ka is the suffix. And I think Wes misheard him and wrote and decided, or whoever makes his videos, right? Maybe he doesn't even make the visuals himself, but so whoever did this, I think, clearly misheard what John said, and I think it also shows that they don't have a strong grasp at all of Hebrew, since they wrote this hatikva, which is a totally different word, meaning a totally different thing, but kind of sounds like Ohavtika. So, ouch. But and if we play it a little bit more, I'll illustrate this further.
Do that, or Huff.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Yes, I know. So when you're thinking this through, you're going, wait. That's 3 words in English, okay, but 1 word in Hebrew. Now, even the Hebrew, though, is a little bit tricky because you've got the verb form, ahavti, I love, and then you've got the 2ms pronominal suffix ka, okay, being added to this word. And the Masoretes, it's clear to me, would count that as 1 word. But Accordance software does not. For those who know, Accordance is this very famous, very good Bible software.
Very good.
But it reckons words differently. It would actually divide that up into at least 2 words,
Okay,
maybe
pause
even
it there.
3. So
Pause it there. So, and I know Accordance wouldn't divide it up into 3 words. It would just divide it up into 2, hafti and ka. But this is not what whoever has made this slide here has done is meaningless gibberish. They've recognized to separate the definite article, the hey, from tikva, but tikva on its own is just a noun. That's like the whole word. So it looks like whoever made this is attempting to separate the I from the love and the you, but this is bad. This is really bad.
I want to read from Stephen Nelson's comment here real quick before we continue. Wes Huff spelled Creole as Creole in one of his slides in a short, so maybe Greek and Hebrew spelling aren't his thing.
Maybe.
Or maybe something more mischievous is going on, but I'll let y'all decide. Let's go to 2236. Oh, we were already there.
Okay.
Let's keep letting this play then.
A friend of mine at Cambridge, Tim Lee, has a software developed. He can show that there are only 16,932 words in the Masoretic text of Isaiah. But contrast that with some of the numbers I'm hearing on the internet about Isaiah having something like 22,000 plus or 25,000 plus, I think I heard. So what's happening is no one, rightly so, life is maybe too busy even for this kind of thing. No one is sitting down and just tabulating out, right, all of the words in the Hebrew Bible of Isaiah. Everyone's kind of falling back on some software, which is okay, but we just got to know what we're doing here, because that's a massive variance. That's a variance of almost 8,000 to 10,000 words right off the top. All right. So I do think that's important when we're talking about statistical analyses. Again, the Masoretes would have had a much lower count of words than Accordance software. And I think that's really, really important to say up front. Because of this, I find all these numbers pretty much irrelevant. I heard that from various channels that maybe the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text of Isaiah have something like 92% correspondence, verbal, word for word correspondence. Okay, 92%. Which, by the way, I don't know what you think about this. That's still pretty close, right? Like, even if that was the final number, I'm going, this is over 1,000 years of copying, right? Remember, a lot of
Still
people
an
have
A.
in mind that it's like the telephone game. This is how ancient manuscripts were copied, you know? Of course, the telephone game, you don't wind up with 92% alignment, right, between the original message and the final one, right?
Whoa,
and you're not
wait
supposed
a
to. It's
minute.
supposed to be fun, right? And the game is supposed to lead to...
Is really?
You want to say something?
No, he just said in the telephone game, you don't end up with 92% alignment in the end. I mean, sometimes you do, right? It just kind of depends. I personally hate the telephone game analogy for explaining textual development and textual differences. But I keep coming back to this, where if we're going to be reducing the number of total words in 1Q Isaiah A, that I'll just say it again, it doesn't reduce the number of variants, though. It actually increases the percentage of the difference if you have the same number of variants in fewer words. That's right, isn't it? I like I said, I'm not great at math, but I think that's right. Am I right about that?
So we'll go to. I'm going to go to
sure
28 minutes now.
Okay.
Actually, I'm going to play this part. Let's see what he's doing here.
Differences are there between the Masoretic text of Isaiah and the Great Isaiah Scroll of Isaiah? Well, I had a research assistant help me out with this, and he found that there were 2,764 total variant entries in this volume. 2,764. So if you're not careful, you're just sort of counting every one of those lines that I showed you, you would wind up with some 2,800 variants. You got to be a little bit cleaner than that, though. Only 1,870 variants did he find between the Masoretic text and the Great Isaiah.
Now, and I'm just going to repeat this. The reason why there's 2,764 variant entries is because when we were working on these volumes, we weren't just making an addition to compare to the Masoretic text. This was a contribution to the textual history of Isaiah, which includes a lot more than the Masoretic text. So lots of those variants are to other textual witnesses to Isaiah, to the Septuagint, to the Targums, to Carbogoniza, to other copies. There's 20 other copies of Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why the list is, in part as long as it is, and so much longer than just if you're going to count the differences between 1Q Isaiah A and the MT. And I'll just come back to this. It's a mistake, I think, to set our focus on the Masoretic text as if this is somehow the gold standard for evaluating the text.
Isaiah scroll, right? So that's like almost down 1,000, 2,800 to about 1,800. There are reasons for why these numbers vary, because everyone needs to hear this. Counting is subjective. The counting is pretty subjective. Okay, we can't just count up every single difference. It doesn't really work that way. I still have curiosities about the numbers, but I'm finding that these numbers don't really mean much. So all I want to say is this: let's just say that there's a baseline of 92% between the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text of Isaiah. I want to show ways in which a qualitative analysis shows that number is going to start to go up big time. And by the way, those percentages are arrived at whatever the total number you've got, divided into however many variants you think there are. That's how the percentages are arrived at. I think there's many, many places where we need to sort of start to throw out examples that are in this list, or at least categorize them differently. We can talk about different kinds of variations, but they're not all textual variants, which imply meaning variants, right? That's really what people want to know. Is the meaning any different between these books, right?
Hold on a second.
Or copies of this.
Do textual variants imply meaning differences? I mean, maybe to the general public they do, but from the perspective of someone who worked in the field and has done a fair bit of textual criticism, meaning is not necessarily the goal in terms of tracking textual variation, and that, textual variation has to do with differences in what's actually appearing on the text, in the texts. Yes, we within the text critical work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've gotten into tracking spelling differences separately from textual differences. We track orthography in addition to textual differences. And yes, most of the textual differences are things that people would consider to be exceptionally benign and irrelevant. But like, this is really important. We're not, when you're making a textual history of a text like the Book of Isaiah for various different reasons. If we're playing far enough through it, at some point he's going to talk about the interchange between using two different prepositions in Hebrew, which essentially are functioning to mean the same thing. But, a Hebrew grammarian, for example, or a Hebrew lexicographer, for example, finds that particular information exceedingly important and valuable because their project is trying to understand how words developed and would change in their usages over time. So, no, we're not just tracking meaning differences because there's so many other questions to be asked when it comes to these texts, when it comes to the manuscripts.
Same book. That's what people, I think, really want to know.
Yeah, I think what that highlights is the qualitative versus quantitative analysis of variance, and the fact that you have this, volume 32, Discoveries of the Judean Desert, that has this long list of what at face value, if you didn't know any better, you would just think, okay, well, here are the textual variants. Here are the differences between something like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text. Well, that's not really giving you the breadth of the information. And this is something that I think people need to recognize, in that when I started to see response videos to myself on my statement, which I have, publicly stated was not the best wording, I think one of the red flags that went up in my mind is someone who, I'm not a textual critic. I study paratextual features, but is kind of adjacent to textual criticism in the fact that I have done textual criticism, albeit I'm not a textual critic, is that I know how tricky numbers are. And when you're talking about something like orthographic or morphological differences, you're talking about something in meaning differences. Those are hard to quantify, especially when you're dealing with words. Like you said, John, when you're dealing with words that are spelled different, Dawid, with the spelled one way or the other way, which in the end would just be read David. And we have multiple examples of this in Greek as well. And when I mentioned, just briefly, because I think it's important to go into some of these differences in terms of the minority of these variants being described as, maybe spelling differences, but we're not sure, as some have said online. I think pertinent to say that when I said that scholars were shocked at the discovery of something like the Great Isaiah Scroll is because what I'm used to seeing when I deal with manuscripts is something like this.
Right.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. Pause it for a second.
So,
and that's very important. What's really, really remarkable about 1Q Isaiah A is that it's as large a manuscript as it is and still as well preserved as it is. It's pretty astonishing that this is a completely essentially completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah that's over 2,000 years old. The vast majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls look like the picture that Wes showed from the book. They're really fragmentary. As I said in the beginning of this conversation, we have very, very few complete manuscripts from any of the Judean desert sites.
I'm going to read from what Stephen Nelson posted earlier. Let me take this off the screen for a second. Variation in Hebrew word counting seems common. Uhlendorf estimated 300,000 tokens in the whole Masoretic text with 7,500 to 8,000 lemata, but the DCH estimates 442,982 tokens, including Hebrew and Aramaic.
And I think I've had this conversation with Stephen too. The difference, because I don't know, maybe he knows if Uhlendorf's count actually includes Aramaic as well, but that could be the reason for some of the difference. But it would be, I think that there's not 132,000 Aramaic words in the Hebrew Bible, so there's something else going on there. But I mean, it's illustrative of the point, right? John Mead is not wrong. Anthony Ferguson is not wrong when it comes to actually counting and identifying what is a word and how we're going to do our counts when we're collecting this data is somewhat subjective. I think the most we can ask is that people are consistent. And for my part, that's the kind of stuff that I don't care nearly as much about as some of these other things that we're seeing within the manuscripts,
which is a very, very fragmentary. And so when you're dealing with something that's so fragmentary, you're trying to piece together. And yet when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, it was so well preserved that it was shocking in that sense. So yeah, why don't you go into some of these sort of differences that we find?
Yeah. So yeah, just to be clear, and because I want to try it, I'm trying to be as fair as possible. The name of David, that's an example of a spelling variant. This same volume, that we looked at earlier, this same volume, DJD, volume 32, again edited by Eugene Ulrich and Peter Flint. They are careful to distinguish that QSP, right, the Qumran spelling practice, also found in 1Q Isaiah A. So here's like a long list again of spelling variants, right? These kinds of things. Only the nerds of nerds are completely interested in this kind of stuff. Okay, but they do a great job culling all of these out. So to be fair, most in this discussion, I think, are working with what Ulrich and Flint have called textual variants. Those are what I actually want to talk about now, because again, that's the big list that folks are trying to use to arrive at, well, there's 92% verbal correspondence between 1Q Isaiah A and the Masoretic text. Well, I'm just shocked at some of the stuff that's in that list of textual variants. Isaiah 58 verse 2, these are going to be hard to actually illustrate because
I
the
think
translations
just pause there
are
for
going
a
to be
second,
identical.
Because John Mead was introduced as a text critic, wasn't he? At the beginning of this video, I think he said that he's a textual critic.
Yeah,
he does textual criticism
I
of the
think
Hebrew
that's
Bible.
right.
It's strange to me that he would be shocked that minutia are included as textual variants, because I mean that's most of it in every critical edition of both, the Hebrew Bible text and the Greek Septuagint and the New Testament text that I've ever seen. This is a huge component of what textual criticism is. And as I said earlier, and I'll say this again, for different reasons, right? Different scholars are using the products of textual criticism to do different things in their own scholarship. So it's really important to track this kind of stuff, even if it looks like it may not have a meaningful function, or if you don't think it's significant, that doesn't mean that it's not significant to the work of someone else.
So now we're going to move to 38 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, 47,
So
55.
and I'll just like you know, I think at one point we don't have to look at it, but I mentioned it already. He talks about how different prepositions are used in the text to mean the same thing, and that's counted as a variant because the preposition has changed. You know, there's a preposition that means upon generally, and another one that means towards generally in Hebrew. But by the time that the great Isaiah scroll was written, there was quite a bit of bleed over in the usage of these two words. Started to look like they became closer and more closely synonymous. So scribes would use them both in, synonymous ways. Like, to me, that's an interesting lexical development, or an interesting grammatical development, and it's still a really important feature to track in the text of Isaiah. Like, if we're just going to ignore those, then that we're the poorer for it if we're not using that information to further develop what we want to know about the development of the language, or the development of the grammar and the syntax.
So having looked at some, again, linguistic, grammatical minutia here, but again, things still being counted by these editors.
Let me pause for a second.
Sure.
Do you have a timestamp for what you were just mentioning a moment ago? I forgot to ask you about that.
For the about the interchange between al and l.
Yeah.
I do not. I'm sorry.
Let me go back a second.
So having looked at some, again, linguistic, grammatical minutia here, but again, things still being counted by these editors. I think this is all kind of wrong-headed. So, but I want to look at now some what we might call significant differences. At least on the surface, they're going to appear as very significant. And then once we kind of take a quick look at them and break them down, we're going to see that not only are these just normal scribal mistakes, okay, committed, right, in the transmission of a book or transmission of a text, but we're going to see that in each case that the antiquity of the Masoretic text is presupposed, and that the error, the big error, so to speak, is on the part of the scribe of the great Isaiah scroll. So we're going to look at Isaiah 40, verses 7 and 8. Yavesh, Chatzir, Navel, Tzitz, Ki Ruach, Adonai, Nashava, Bo, Akain, Chatzir, Ha'am. Something like, the grass withers, the flower falls, because the breath of Yahweh blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. That's how verse 7 reads. And then in verse 8, we get the same four words. Yavesh, Chatzir, Navel, Tzitz. The grass withers, the flower falls, but the word of our God remains forever. Wouldn't you know it, Wes? Because again, there are four identical words here. Yavesh, Chatzir, Navel, Tzitz starts verse 7. It also starts verse 8. And I challenge any of our listeners here to try to copy some things by hand and see if you don't commit a similar mistake in whatever you're copying. But here, the scribe of the great Isaiah scroll actually skips all of verse 7, or what will amount to 12 words in the Hebrew text. This sounds like a really, really big difference, right? And it is. But the mechanism for the error is really, really easy to spot. It's simply because the scribe skipped over the first instance of the grass withers, the flower falls. He copies the instance in verse 8 of those four words, keeps on copying. All of verse 7 is effectively omitted. The other interesting thing is we don't have time to go into all of this, but the great Isaiah scroll itself shows knowledge of the mistake. because either the original scribe or a later corrector, someone actually includes the missing words kind of between the lines and down the margin, okay, of the scroll. We'll see that pretty plainly. But
Pause
that's
it there
an
for a
example of what we
second.
call
Oh, can you back it up to the picture because I want to point something out.
Yeah.
So, and I hope everyone hears. Yeah, just let
actually
it go
includes the
and then
missing
pause it on the picture.
words kind of between the lines and down the
There
margin,
you go.
okay,
All right,
of
pause it. Yeah. So I'll say something about this. First of all, what he's getting at is the kind of textual changes that we see most often in any manuscript are errors and mistakes made by scribes. Lots of these occur when the eye skips, a scribe is tired or just not as good as his job as others, and he will miss chunks of text because in this case you've got the same phrase of 4 words repeated at the beginning of each verse. He let his eye skip from the one to the other and thought that's what he should be copying next. It's sort of understandable mistake that anyone would make. And it must be pointed out that these are the vast majority of scribal interventions and scribal changes that we see within manuscripts. Importantly, it is not all of them. And the minority of changes, intentional changes to the text, which affect the meaning of the text, are something that still needs to be dealt with, even if they're among the minority. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here, it's probably hard for people to see, but if you can see there in the red box,
I'll put it on full screen.
above the line, yeah, in the red box above the line, you'll notice there is a word, and then it looks like there's 4 dots followed by 2 other words. Do you see that, Jacob?
I see the dots. Yeah.
Yeah. Any idea, any guesses about what those 4 dots are? It's okay if you don't know.
Well,
I'm just curious.
my best guess would, and just to be sure, Ron, did you say the 4 dots are on the top right of the
Yeah.
box?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Then I definitely see them. I would say it might indicate the scribe has some doubt about what he's doing. I don't know.
Okay, that's a good guess, actually. This
Oh.
is now often what happens. Dots like this appear in a manuscript as a form of erasure. Scribes would often put dots above letters and below letters that they wanted to be removed that were in there by mistake. But that's not what is happening here. This particular scribe who wrote this insertion, and we actually recognize this particular scribe from a handful of other manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he always does the same thing, wherever he is representing the Tetragrammaton, the name of Yahweh, the divine name, he doesn't. Sometimes in the scrolls, it's written out in Paleo Hebrew script, like the old Hebrew script, as opposed to the square Aramaic script. Sometimes they just write it out as it reads, but sometimes on a few rare occasions they just replace it with these 4 dots, which I think is kind of cool. But I just wanted to draw your attention to that.
Of the scroll. We'll see that pretty plainly. But that's an example of what we call parablepsis. It was a mistake caused as the scribe was working from his exemplar, right, his copy. Okay, he was copying. He looked over, or he actually commits the eye skip, and then comes back and copies that text, but he's already missed the intervening text. Okay, he's omitted that accidentally. This is an example of parablepsis, an error that a scribe commits when they look away from their copy to their exemplar and then they come back. That's all it takes to commit a big mistake in copying something that amounts to 12 individual words. Okay, that's a lot for a text like this. Okay. Now, because Isaiah 47-8 is sometimes debated. Chapter 4 of Isaiah, verses 5 and 6. I won't read the Hebrew, but an English translation might read something like this. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day. There's that word by day. Hang on to that for a second. And smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade by day. Yomam, same Hebrew word, from the heat, and for a refuge and a shelter from the storm and rain. That's the entire Masoretic text. What's fascinating, though, is that when you look at the great Isaiah scroll at Isaiah 4, verses 5 and 6, between the first Yomam by day and the second Yomam by day, there are something like 14 words in between those in the Hebrew text, all of them accidentally omitted in the great Isaiah scroll.
I think that's an important note. The parablepsis is what happens when a copyist's line of sight drifts from one word or set of letters in his master copy or his exemplar to the same or similar words in a set of letters that are further along in that master copy, accidentally skipping the words or the letters in between. And if people are familiar with my content, I've talked on multiple instances about things like homoteliuton or homo articon, similar endings or similar beginnings, where we see these in multiple manuscripts. And these are reasonable scribal mistakes.
That's right.
Where we can see exactly what's happening, where a scribe sees an ending of a word, a line that ends in a similar word, and then his eyes go from the exemplar to the copy, and then he goes back to the exemplar and he sees that similar word, but it's maybe a few letters or a few lines down the page, and it's a similar ending word. And so then he, in effectiveness, skips those sentences.
That's right.
And these are things that we need to be careful of in saying, okay, well, these are overt textual variants. Well, yes, they are, but they are reasonably explained in how the scribe made a mistake.
Well, yeah, you're right. And what I would go a little further on that and just say, we see these in 1Q Isaiah A. The only text that presupposes the error made in 1Q Isaiah A is the proto-Masoretic text that the scribe is copying. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So, in other words, it's not a different text in this instance than that. It's actually the Masoretic text that has to be assumed to make sense of the parablepsis in 1Q Isaiah A. Yeah.
Right. So word for word, not exactly, but in instances like Isaiah 40, verses 7 and 8, you can see exactly what is happening, and you can fill in the gaps where the scribe has automatically made a mistake that you can reasonably explain what is going on. There's not nefarious intent. It was clearly in the original. The scribe has just made a mistake in terms of the copying. But it was originally there. It's just there's a reasonable explanation in terms of why it's not existing.
Now, the Isaiah scroll also has one other.
What was that?
No, I was going to say, I mean, this is all, totally right about all this stuff. And it's not something that anybody is trying to ignore or to hide or anything. We're not trying to obfuscate this truth of the matter or the facts of the situation by simply pointing out that there are high numbers of textual differences and textual variation amongst manuscripts. But I think what often gets missed in these sorts of discussions is just like, on the one hand, I think we can marvel a little bit at how remarkable at how good scribes were in antiquity, most of them at least, at doing their jobs and at copying texts and ensuring that that they were accurately and pragmatically preserved. Yes, we can marvel at that and say that's great, that's amazing. But I always tend to think that this also reveals something about the fragility of the process. We excuse me, we have surviving texts within the Bible, which scholars are pretty sure have been, what's the word I'm looking for? Corrupted, right? There's a problem with the text. Somebody has made a mistake. Scholars are keen enough to identify these within the Hebrew text. And because we don't have access to the manuscripts to, show us what they were copying from when the mistake was made, we're just left with that. So this is the situation is a little bit fragile, and the text is. This is one of the reasons why we tend to describe some a situation fluidity when it comes to the text of the Hebrew Bible in the Second Temple period, because part of that has to do with the transmission and repetition of errors through time that don't get corrected because they all didn't get corrected, right? But working in tandem with that is the strenuous efforts of scribes to fix texts for various reasons, to ensure that they were more useful for their communities, to ensure that they were more contemporary to their present situations, for a variety of reasons. Scribes were actively involved in the editorial process of their texts.
So now I'm going to go back a bit in the video. I'm going to go to 10 minutes.
Tradition. But one thing I should add here now is that even in the consonantal tradition, there were letters that functioned like vowels. Even English has this, right? When we use y, ey specifically, like on likely. Or very. The Y here is not its consonantal. It doesn't have the consonant sound, ya, right? It simply is being used as an I vowel. Well, Hebrew has a similar use of a yod, right? That ya sound can also function in place of, say, I class vowels. And it also has one that's W or wow, although in modern Israeli Hebrew it's always pronounced as a V, vav. But anyhow, wow functioned as a vowel.
The only
letter.
Guys that I ever hear pronouncing it wow seem to come from these evangelical conservative seminaries. I don't know why that is. I have no idea. But everywhere else I go, everybody just pronounces it vav, and vocalizes it usually as a V. Anyways.
Usually for U and O vowels. And then they had a letter hey. That makes the huh sound. And on the ends of words, huh could mark long vowels, mainly long A vowels, but it could also mark long O vowels as well, depending on the context. The problem with that system is that it wasn't thorough and it wasn't consistent. When you hit the scribes at Qumran, they developed a special scribal spelling practice. Okay, I think Emmanuel Tove calls this QSP, Qumran Spelling Practice. And lots of different interventions and innovations.
Sorry, the actual term is Qumran Scribal Practice is the term that Tove coined.
Of orthography or spelling are introduced into biblical manuscripts at this point. A very simple example, Wes. I use this in some of my writing and teaching. How do you spell the name David in Hebrew? Well, you've got Daleth, Wow, Daleth, okay? D-W-D or D-V-D, okay, in the consonantal text. And underneath all of those wows in the Masoretic text, there's a little dot that signifies an I vowel or a hirik. That gives us the Dawid, okay, the Dawid, okay, spelling. But long before that little dot for the I vowel was introduced, many Jewish scribes were spelling David D-W-Y-D. And what's fascinating, Wes, is that the Dead Sea Scroll spelling of David is almost everywhere D-W-Y-D. Even though those manuscripts are really old, They actually introduced the new spelling of David, or the updated spelling of David, his name. We know what's original because we can go back to something known as the Tel Dan inscription, which is dated to the 9th century BC. It's actually the first unattested time we see the name of David in the archaeological record, and it's in the expression Beit Dawid, house of David. And David there is spelled as D-W-D without the Y, you see. So even in these Dead Sea Scrolls, which represent the oldest leather or parchment, right, for writing surfaces, they already show the updating of the language. Whereas the Masoretic text, oftentimes, though it's the newer leather, the newer writing surface, the newer manuscript, the Masoretic text is preserving the oldest textual tradition. That is the oldest wording, oftentimes. Now, this is not, I'm not speaking in universals here. This is just generally how these things work.
Any comments on that?
So, not really. Although I will say this is probably of some interest. Like he's correct that what we identify as longer orthography, the inclusion of these vowel letters, is something that is a late development. And Christopher Rolston has actually collected all the data on this from every Hebrew inscription from the Iron Age, I think, all the way up to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and has actually shown that when you get far enough back, like into, I think it's into the 9th, 10th century and earlier, there are just no vowel letters used anywhere. And interestingly, this is one of the, in my opinion, one of the really, really strong features. You remember the Mount of Ball curse tablet that's stripling. So in my opinion, one of the really strong, I mean, beyond the fact that it's just a bunch of skulls in layers of lead, one of the really strong arguments against the existence or even the accuracy of the transcription produced by Stripling or by Galil and Van der Veen is that there is a tendency towards long orthography, the use of vowel letters in their transcription, which would make the Mount of Ball tablet literally the only one from before, like, the 8th century, the only text from before the 8th century to use vowel letters like that. It's completely unheard of. And then even by like the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries, the usage of vowel letters is still really rare. It's very uncommon. It doesn't get to be, a matter of common spelling until later in the Hellenistic period. So sorry, I think I find
no problem.
Interesting.
So now we're going to go back to where we were earlier.
Feature to it. I want to mention this. We won't go into it in great detail, but I want to mention it because it will explain why people are seeing such variation, in the text of the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text of Isaiah. There are some 4 or 5 differences in the second half of the scroll, Isaiah 34 to Isaiah 66. There are places at the bottoms of the columns in very regular intervals where the scribe either omitted text or he tried to remember what was in the exemplar, and he tried to fill it in by memory, And we know this because we can at least reconstruct, and this is the work of Drew Longacre, whose name hasn't been mentioned much on the internet, but he's one who knows the scroll quite well. Drew shows quite nicely that the exemplar that 1Q Isaiah A used must have been damaged because all of these kinds of variants in only chapters 34 to 66 appear at the bottom of columns and at the regular intervals in the scroll, showing that the copy that 1Q Isaiah A was being made from was kind of being put on a rack time and time again, so much so that the bottom edge of the scroll was
because he kind of butchered the explanation for what's going on here, and I think it's worth getting into. And this is some of the stuff that I've done a fair bit of waving my arms and talking about when it comes to 1Q Isaiah A in public spaces. Just back it up to that image that he showed, that Wes showed. Yeah, this one. The way he said it, he says that there are, as it sounds like he's saying that at regular intervals in 1Q Isaiah A, at the bottom of the columns, the scribe is actually leaving chunks of space because his exemplar is damaged. That's not precisely what's going on. What's happening is spread throughout this second half of the manuscript, which we definitely need to talk about. Spread throughout the second half of 1Q Isaiah A, at even intervals, you see places where within the column, the scribe has left a gap, a space of usually 1 or 2 lines, and it's filled in by a second hand. So a different scribe has come in and filled it in with the text. When we first saw this in 1Q Isaiah A, we couldn't figure out what was going on. Drew Longaker wrote this really nice article, and a very convincing article, where I think he makes a really persuasive case that the exemplar, the copy from which the scribe of the second half of Isaiah is copying from, is damaged on the bottom. I suppose it could be at the top, but it's damaged either at the top or the bottom, so that lines of text are actually missing from the exemplar, and the scribe who's actually writing out the second half of Isaiah can't see, like he can't tell what the missing text is because it's missing. Sometimes, though, he's feeling really ballsy and he just goes from memory and fills in what he thinks the text is. And we can tell this, which is pretty cool, because it's close. It's the gist of what the meaning of the text is, but it's clearly a little different. It's a bit of a paraphrase. It uses synonymous language, it uses some slightly different grammatical forms to say the same thing, right? So I don't know, I think that's kind of cool. That's what he's getting at here, and he's making this point to show that these are major differences within 1Q Isaiah A, which contribute to this sense that there's, substantial textual variation within this manuscript, but that these are easily explained as, the result of damage to the scroll that is being, the one that's being copied from for this manuscript. Now, and yeah, he's absolutely right about that. And importantly, the text that is used to fill in those gaps is the Masoretic text. I believe in almost every single instance, it's the Masoretic text. Yeah, like he's not wrong about any of this stuff, but I think he's slipping past what I see as the most significant aspect of this feature of this manuscript. He said it pretty quickly, and I hope people picked up on it, but he said he noted that this is a feature of only the second half of this manuscript. There's none of these gaps left by the scribe in the first half of the manuscript. The scribe of the first half of the manuscript has, his copy is not damaged, whereas the scribe of the second half appears to be working from a damaged manuscript. And importantly, something that he didn't note, he should like this. I believe that Longaker also pointed out in his article that the second half of 1Q Isaiah A is actually a little closer to the Masoretic text than the first half of 1Q Isaiah A. Did you? I think this is something that we should talk about, and I sent you a link. Do you want to just put that up on the screen so that we can actually look at the manuscript and I can show you some things about what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that right now.
And is this the last thing we're doing, Jacob?
We have one more thing to look at. One more.
Okay. All right.
Then we're done, literally.
Okay, that's fine. But yeah, so let's look at this. Have you been on this site before?
It looks familiar to me, but I'm not certain.
Okay, so just click the picture of the 1Q Isaiah A, and it'll pull up. There you go. Now this is pretty groovy. If you just if you click and drag the mouse to the left, it'll actually unroll the scroll. You have to hold it down. You have to hold your button down and drag it.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that, and it's not letting me.
It's not working, eh? Weird. Oh no.
Oh, wait a minute.
There you go. See, isn't that cool?
I think yeah,
Very cool. Okay.
I didn't realize I used the ruler thing.
Oh yeah, you can use the slider in the bottom there too. Okay, if you go to the middle, which is column 27. The columns are numbered on the bottom. Right there. Stop. Okay. So this is what you see in the middle of your screen. You actually see 3 full columns from right to left. Column 26, column 27, column 28. Column 27 looks a little bit narrower than the other 2. You'll also notice that column 27 is at the end of a sheet. Do you see the stitching there just to the left of column 27, which is stitching the 2 sheets together? Zoom in using there's a magnifying glass.
Is it right over here?
Yes, that's the stitching. Yeah. So if you just zoom in and look at the bottom of that column, it's not going to
the bottom.
Can you drag it up? Yeah. Look at the bottom. So no, notice maybe just drag it over a little bit so we can see all of column 26. Yeah, that way. Go that way. Uh-oh. It's not working very well, is it? Okay.
Column 26,
So you're on go to column 27. Sorry. So yeah, just drag it that way. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So you'll notice, so what you're looking at at the end of column 27 is the end of Isaiah chapter 33. And you'll notice, what do you see there at the bottom? You'll notice that the scribe has left 3 empty lines at the bottom of the manuscript.
Bottom left.
You see that? Yeah, on the left side. You can actually see the ruling marks. Do you see the horizontal line?
Yeah, is this where my mouse is circling right here?
Yeah.
This area?
So
Okay,
even
that's
higher
right.
than
Okay, but
that,
I'm
you
looking
can
at it.
see, you can kind of still see the line of the 3 empty lines at the bottom. This is a unique. Yeah, this is a unique feature in this manuscript, in that the scribe has not left big gaps like this anywhere else in this particular scroll. But we do know of this particular gap from other Judean desert manuscripts, also in Qumran, but in places like Matzadah and Mutabat and Nachal Hever. We see the same thing. And in every single manuscript copy that we have, which includes these large 3-line gaps like this, sometimes they're only a single line, but certainly there's a few manuscripts where you have a 3-line gap. And every single time it always indicates the same thing and only the same thing. It indicates the end of a composition, the end of a book. And then what follows it is the beginning of a new book. So for example, in a manuscript of Genesis Exodus that's written in Paleo Hebrew script from Qumran, at the very end of Genesis, at the very last verse, it ends and there's 3 lines left empty before the very beginning of the first verse of Exodus chapter 1, which is kind of cool. So if that's what this gap means, everywhere where we see it, what are the implications of this for this particular manuscript? I think it's pretty significant to my eye and to my way of thinking. And this is how the editors and scholars who have written about this manuscript in large part have interpreted this feature, that it appears that for this scribe, he's marking the end of the book of Isaiah, which is kind of wild. I don't know how familiar you are with the developmental history of the book of Isaiah, scholars' theories about the book of Isaiah for a couple of hundred years
Yeah,
now.
I do remember that they think it was written in 3 stages and been compiled together into one document, right?
Over hundreds of years, yes. And
Yeah.
usually the break is usually the way scholars factor in the composition is that Isaiah 1 through 39 comprises first Isaiah chapter 40 through 55 is second Isaiah, and first Isaiah roughly was written in the 8th, 7th century BCE. Second Isaiah, which is chapter 40 through 55, was written at some point during the Babylonian captivity, during the time in which there was no temple in Jerusalem. And third Isaiah, from Isaiah 56 to 66, was then written at a time when the second temple had been rebuilt. This is pretty cool because the scribe seems to recognize that the book of Isaiah is a composite work. Now, he hasn't put his division where scholars would, but I think it's important to say something else about this too. If you know the book of Isaiah well, you'll recognize that there's oracles of Isaiah, basically from chapter 7. So there's oracles in Isaiah in chapters 1 and 2, and then narrative in chapter 3 and 4, and then oracles in 5, and more narrative in 6. So a little bit of narrative and oracles in the beginning, and then it's just straight oracles from Isaiah, basically from like chapter 7 all the way through to chapter 35. And then chapters 36 through 39 is a chunk of historical narrative which looks virtually identical to the text of 2 Kings. I think it's 2 Kings chapters 20 through 23. One was basically reproduced from the other, or they were, both coming from a very similar source. But so there's this narrative section after chapter 35. And scholars, when speaking about the composition and the development of the book of Isaiah, will often look at chapters 34 and 35 as much later than everything that appears from chapter 1 through chapter 33. So, the division line between first and second Isaiah can get a little fuzzy, even though most scholars put it at between chapter 39 and chapter 40. But what I think is really significant here is that here is a scribe with a scroll which seems to recognize this, seems to recognize that Isaiah is a composite work and that there is a dividing point here. There's something different following Isaiah chapter 33. Now, I have to say something else important because he kind of glossed over all that. But John Mead also glossed over this. Remember, I said that, so remember now, the second half of 1Q Isaiah A seems to represent, an addition to the original prophecies of Isaiah ben notes from the 8th century. Importantly, you'll remember I also said that these big gaps in the text where the exemplar the scribe was using was damaged, these only appear in the second half of the scroll where the second, third Isaiah belongs. Also, this second half of the scroll, I believe, I will have to double check this, but I believe that this second half of the scroll is also closer textually to the MT than the first half. A strong case has been made now that the first half of this scroll of 1Q Isaiah A from chapters 1 through 33 was copied from like a copy of just Isaiah chapter 1 to 33. And the second half was copied from an entirely different manuscript. And I always raise this question. Why would you need 2 manuscripts to copy this scroll, this whole book of Isaiah? And then why would you break it in the middle if it wasn't already extant in, separate copies as separate compositions? And I'll say one more thing about this, because we actually have some further evidence from the larger collection of Isaiah manuscripts at Qumran, which supports this. There's a total of 21 copies of Isaiah in the Qumran scrolls. 3 of those copies were copies of the entire book, including 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B, 4 copies, 4Q Isaiah A and 4Q Isaiah C. So 4 out of those 21 copies were copies of the entire book of Isaiah from chapter 1 to chapter 66. They're fragmentary, though. Only 1Q Isaiah A is intact. These other ones are fragmentary, but we're highly confident contain the entire book from chapters 1 through chapter 66. Now, what's really, really interesting is that all of the 17 remaining copies of the book of Isaiah at Qumran are copies of either only first Isaiah from chapters 1 through 33 or second and third Isaiah from chapter 34 to 66, or maybe even just second Isaiah or just third Isaiah. But we know this. Like this is established. And this is established through a lot of the work that I and others do when it comes to reconstructing manuscripts from fragments and trying to calculate how large these texts were, even when they're, pretty fragmentary. But I think that's pretty remarkable, because I think it illustrates this composite nature of the book of Isaiah surviving all the way into like the 1st century BCE. And we actually have manuscript evidence for this. Like, how cool is that? That's very cool. And it annoys me when people just ignore this stuff.
Now for the final part.
In the
Going to 4850.
Okay.
This is where he goes on a rant about the consensus. So I'll start at 45.
Agree on how this works, but I will say wielding a sword of scholarly consensus in textual matters is disingenuous, Wes. You can't do that in these things, because scholars simply have, they're independent. They have their own minds, and they actually think about these things quite independently. This is not going to work, consensus or whatever, because anytime I can show where Ulrich and Tove sort of diverge on something like this, no consensus is there, okay, at that point. So, and that's just the way these things are. There's a certain amount of subjectivity in how we parse out what's counted as a word, even, then what counts as a true meaning variant, and then maybe some productive statistics could come from that. But you can see why statistics aren't going to tell a very accurate story, because it all comes down to who's putting in the data. Who's doing the counting, who's doing the weighing, the evaluating, on and on.
Yeah, and this is why we need to be careful when we look at something like volume 32.
Pause it there for a second, which is why it's so important that when we're accumulating the data, that we're not making decisions about what's meaningful in terms of the variance. Like I hope people picked up on that, and this is troubling to me, right? As much as Eugene Ulrich has written extensively about his own ideas regarding the development of the biblical text, and I tend to include myself in, if he's got a camp, I'm in the Eugene Ulrich camp, along with scholars like Shimer Talmud and Jonathan Campbell, Yuha Hakala, when it comes to understanding the nature of textual development. As much as he's written about all of that stuff, for the DJD edition, the official edition, the reason why he just collected variants or instructed, the reason why the mandate for the entire team doing the work, the reason why the mandate was just to collect the data, is because he recognized this. He recognizes that scholars are going to bring their biases to this project. So just give us the data. And, as I said, it's troubling to me when people like John Mead or Anthony Ferguson want to talk about eliminating synonymous terms from their collection of the data, because that's not helpful to me as somebody who might hold a different opinion about the development of the text than you do. If John Mead is going to eliminate the crossover between prepositions L and L in his accumulation of the data, that's not helpful to lexicographers and grammarians who are developing and who are working on the development of the Hebrew language. There's a reason why it's important to try and check our biases at the door, but then please stop complaining to me about the ways in which scholars have gone about the work in terms of the data that they have chosen to collect, how they've chosen to organize it.
I'm gonna take this super chat from Domingo Avilas. Thank you for your super chat. So El you or Jolmean, Yahweh is El. Yeah.
Does it mean Yahweh is El or Yahweh is my God? No, it means Yahweh is El in both instances.
So before we close, do you have any closing thoughts about all these clips, or not really?
I mean, I think I've said a lot tonight, and I think that I think that's an important point to end on. The message that I just want to communicate. In the first place, I couldn't be happier that lots of people are talking about 1Q Isaiah A, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and textual criticism and textual development right now. That's pretty great because it's all really interesting. I hope people find this stuff continuously interesting. So awesome. But I hope that if there's one thing people hear from me, or if there's a couple of things, it's some of the stuff I've been repeating tonight. The collection of the data is really important. And in my opinion, the more data, the better. So yes, I want my variance list to be comprehensive and large, and I'll make the determination as the scholar reading through the lists as to the meaningfulness or the significance of each individual variant, but they all need to be evaluated on a piece by piece basis. So that's the first thing, and then the second thing is that the scrolls by and large, and the biblical scrolls, are so much more interesting in so many ways than just calculating how closely they align to the Masoretic text. There's other versions that we should be looking at. There's other questions that we should be asking with regards to these texts. We did a little bit of this with 1Q Isaiah A this evening, I think, pointing out the bifurcation at the end of chapter 33 and the difference between the two halves of Isaiah, and how that's also reflected in the broader manuscript evidence from Qumran, is a really exciting feature of textual development that we only see from looking closely at the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So Stephen Nelson has something to say to you. Kipp Davis, for the New Testament, the NA28 CT is more inclusive of variant since it's aimed at scholars. And the UBS 5 is aimed at pastors, students, and translator. Is there an analog in Old Testament text criticism?
Not really, because all we have is Biblia Hebraica. So we had Biblia Hebraica Stuckertensia, which replaced Biblia Hebraica, the Kittle version. And that is now in the process of being replaced by Biblia Hebraica Quinta, or BHQ, which is a multi-volume work. And I believe that the system tends to the system is that is operative is the same as the Nestle Island, to be more inclusive and geared towards scholars. It's not really like a less inclusive version. The only other thing we have is the Hebrew Bible Project, which is an exhaustive, or purports to be an exhaustive text critical edition, meaning that it's actually got an apparatus that includes all the manuscripts. It probably doesn't actually include all the manuscripts, but it's a lot. And as you can imagine, there's only like 4 of those volumes that have ever been published, and they're gigantic and pretty impractical to use. So, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was a good question too. And well, I have Kipp Davis's YouTube channel in the description below, tagged. So you click on that hyperlink, and it will take you to the channel. Go over there and subscribe if you haven't already done so. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Kipp Davis.
Thank you very much. And if you guys, if anyone in your audience is interested in taking biblical Hebrew, go check out Digital Hammurabi. And I will be starting a new course in the first week of March. So go sign up.
Awesome. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.